Are you looking to improve your running, decrease times, and stay more resilient with your running? Well, this video today, I'm gonna cover everything you need to do from a strength and conditioning perspective to stay resilient, drop those times, and be a better runner. Let's get to it. Hey there, Brandon here from Thirst Gym, and today I'm gonna help you walk through step by step and explain everything you need to do to stay resilient and drop those times and improve your running. Big issue with a lot of runners is they fear the weight room, and for good reason, I understand, because they think they're gonna get bulky, they're gonna slow down, and they're gonna see their times decrease. But what we found, especially through research, is that proper strength and conditioning methods for runners, even distance runners, helps drop your times and keeps you more resilient. We understand that you've got to put a lot of miles on your body, so your strength training is going to look different than, say, like a football player or a wrestler or a boxer, right? So we want to make sure that our training means match our goals, and we can also balance the recovery side of it, because for many distance runners, the mileages can get incredibly high as we approach race day and race times. So this blend today, I'm going to give you everything you need step by step to help take your running to the next level through proper strength conditioning methods and making sure it's sustainable long-term, so that you can not only keep running, but keep coming to the weight room and seeing those times improve year over year. All right, the first thing we got to talk about here as a runner is the number one problem that I see working with running athletes are injuries. And in particular, most of these are overuse-based injuries, which means that you're doing too much, too fast, or too long, not allowing for enough recovery. Maybe your nutrition's not there, your mileage is too high, you're not getting enough sleep. Could be a number of things, but generally they're overuse. And overuse means we need to decrease that or increase our recovery capacity and our readiness and preparedness to be able to run. So the most common ones I have here are IT band syndrome, plantar fasciitis, shin splints, runner's knee, Achilles issues, and stress fractures. So I'm gonna go into a little bit of detail of each one here. So the IT band in particular is this, I hate to even call it the IT band, because the real issue is actually the TFL, if I'm being honest. And that muscle is on the side of your hip. And generally it's gonna take your leg away from the side of your body. So abduction, we're actually gonna do that. And that's a primary mover of it. However, the TFL also does hip flexion as well, which can be great to be able to help you when you run. However, what happens is athletes that have weaker glutes and hamstrings over rely on the hip flexion aspect of their running. And if their glutes and their hamstrings are stronger, they get better propulsion, they can actually perform more hip extension, and they're not as reliant as on their hip flexion. In particular, therefore, the TFL T-band takes the grunt of the load if those other musculatures are weak or not as developed, or they're not up to par for what you need to do from the performance side, and the TFL takes the grunt. And then that bothers you when you run, you have like the snapping hip syndrome, or just the side of your hip is always achy while you're running and you're feeling it. That's your TFL screaming at you, telling you that your posterior chain probably needs a little bit more work. Another one is plantar fasciitis. Basically, underneath your foot, we got this nice big piece of fascia that comes down from the Achilles and the calf complex, and this gets overused from a lot of running. And sometimes this can be based on your shoe wear. So I'm not an expert in that side in terms of the running. Runners, you can comment below your favorite footwear or shoes that you recommend that have helped you with this kind of issue. But for many people, having proper ankle mobility and doing soft tissue work on the bottoms of their feet a couple days a week with a lacrosse ball, tennis ball, golf ball, getting some big toe extensor work in, that can help minimize and having issues with the plantar fasciitis. Again, the other issue with this as well is that people just crank their mileage up too high too fast. So they don't build in well enough to allow for proper adaptation, and the fascia ends up taking some of the grunt. If you happen to have flat feet, you're probably more prone to this. There's usually nothing that you can do to actually really truly build those arches back up to be normal. Sometimes that can be genetic, myself included, but you can do some strengthening of your feet as well, doing towel grabs and things of that nature that can strengthen the bottom of your feet, that can also help mitigate this, especially if you're flat-footed. Other one is shin splints. Shin splints, again, is another big overuse issue, and not just in runners, but athletes of all kinds that have to do running as part of their sport. But shin splints, to me, tells me that there's just too much too fast in terms of the volume, the intensity, the amount of running and mileage that you're doing. So the best way to avoid it is to build in gradually and have phases of your running throughout the year. But you can also do some lower limb complex based work to be able to address that. You can strengthen that musculature a little bit. Again, addressing some calf mobility will also aid this. And usually shin splints leads to then compartment syndrome, which then leads to people having to get cut in terms of opening those compartments up so that there's not all that pressure. Probably can be avoided, but the bad thing about shin splints is once you get it, it's really hard to get rid of. You've got to have to detrain yourself and drop that mileage to be able to let this recover and then strengthen that lower complex at the same time. Runner's knee is usually patellofemoral pain, which means right below the kneecap here, you're starting to feel that below your knee. And generally this is kind of a mix of two things. One, it's a mix of that hip flexor issues that we kind of talked about at the beginning, is that the hip flexors are doing so much work. Well, we have a muscle called the rectus femoris that actually crosses the knee joint and the hip joint, so it can do hip flexion and knee extension, which is great. However, that can also begin to cause a problem as it's coming down and gets tight, because if we're tight here, then we're going to have some pulling down there. Also, quads get tight in runners because, again, they don't have adequate glute and hamstring strength if they're having those issues. So the quads are doing a lot of the work in terms of the running as well, and we don't really want that, you know, especially as the cyclic nature of it. Those quads can get tight, and that kind of constantly pulls. Plus, there's also all the ground reaction forces that are coming up the leg with every single step and run that you take, and then that can also exacerbate the problem as well. So for this, the best thing that you can do is, again, develop your posterior chain strength and continue to foam roll and do different couch stretch mobilizations to keep that lengthened as much as you can. That will relieve the tension and stress on that patellofemoral area. Almost lastly here, the Achilles. Achilles ruptures are, I wouldn't honestly say common, but having Achilles pain is common with runners. And so the best way to avoid this is to, one, do direct calf-based work in a full range of motion, so a big stretch, a good quality contraction, ample load, use eccentrics. All those things will help prevent some of this, but you can also do active stretching and mobilizations as well, warming up well before you go run, making sure you're doing some extra soft tissue work after you run or on your off days. That will all keep things like your Achilles tendon issues away. It's just something you're gonna have to stay on top of. And then stress fractures. Stress fractures are kind of like the last step, okay? You're probably gonna start to see these things before you see a stress fracture, because the tissues will get aggravated much easier than you will actually probably having a stress fracture, okay? Not always, but in most cases. A stress fracture means that the bone, again, this can be usually in the foot for a lot of runners, but it could be in the lower leg as well, like a fibula. But usually what you're gonna find is that small fracture, you know, it's very, very small, but it's from repeated stress. And because you're running on surfaces, and especially you're more likely to get this, you're running on hard surfaces all the time, all those ground reaction forces are constantly going through your feet and your legs and up into your body, and doing that repetitively. Think if you're running 20-some miles on pavement, right? That's a lot of stress going into your feet. So that's why, again, footwear can be incredibly important. Again, not my wheelhouse. So, you know, listen to your runners out there of what they trust and think works best. But from a strength training perspective, if we build in our training methodically with our mileage, add in quality strength training, get some extra conditioning work through cyclical methods like using bikes and row ergs and swimming, we can still develop the cardiovascular aspect without all the stress fractures. So that's a good way to lead into your running, is to get that workload up, so then you can actually build into your running as well. And so if your training is phasic in nature, that will kind of take care of itself. But that's really the only way you're going to be able to avoid stress fractures, doing quality strength training, because it is going to improve the bone density, which is going to make them more resilient, but also methodically increasing your mileage and doing some kind of cardiovascular work, or cross training, as many runners like to call it, that's cyclical, that's not ground reaction dependent like running, and you can get those cardiovascular adaptations without having to bang your feet and your knees up in the process. Okay, now that we've kind of covered the common injuries, how does strength training help you as a runner? And there's three primary ways that strength training is going to aid you. The first one's going to be improved tissue tolerance, okay? The nice thing about lifting is that our tissues get subjected to much more load via the weights that we're using, or the bands or the cables, you know, the resistance that we're doing. And we can build up the tissue tolerance, the amount of work that they can handle, the amount of force that they can handle, by progressive overload of just general quality strength training. And so when the muscles get stronger and those tissues get stronger, they're less likely to get aggravated and annoyed, because now they're working at a lower percentage of their 1 rep max, hypothetically, which means that then we can do more work, right? If you're doing any activity, like a sprint, for example, you can only sprint 100% all out for 10 seconds, right? So running, we know you don't have to do that. So you know you can cover more distance because you're working at a lower percentage of that speed and you can get farther. The same way is going to apply with strength training. If your muscles get stronger, if the tissue, for example, can only handle 100 pounds and your running requires you to run at 80 pounds, you're stressing that tissue at a high amount. However, if that tissue can now handle 200 pounds and you're still at that 80 pounds, theoretically, you can go up to 100 pounds of force, so putting more effort in, and you're still working at less effort than you were to begin with, okay? So the tissue tolerance thing is very big for runners because you guys run a ton of miles, right? So the better tissue tolerance you have, the more likely you're able to run, the less likely you are to get injured, and then you can continue to train and stack up positive days and training sessions, which availability is always important when it comes to training, regardless of what sport you do. The second is going to be improved movement capacity. So having better quality movement through ankle mobility, hamstring mobility, hip flexor mobility, right? Especially in the lower limbs, based from the hips down, the more better of quality movement that you have, the better you are going to be able to, one, have better running mechanics. You're also less likely to get injured because then you're not going to have faulty movement patterns. And when you have faulty movement patterns, usually muscles take the grunt of that until it's either fixed or you get injured. It's usually one of the two. So if you can improve your movement capacity, you're not only going to probably run better and more fluid, but the muscles that are going to make the gait the most efficient are going to be the ones that do the work, not the ones that are taking the grunt to compensate for the poor movement patterns. And the third thing is going to be forces, okay? Force absorption and being able to express that force, okay? So if you are stronger and your bones have more density to them, you can absorb that force better over the long haul, which, as I've mentioned multiple times already, the amount of mileage that you put in, the amount of forces you're putting into your body are huge. So better bone density, better tissue tolerance lets you absorb those forces better over time, which then can let you be more efficient, right? And less likely to get injured. But then also how you produce force. So again, going back to kind of the tissue tolerance thing a little bit here, but if you can produce more force with every single step, your times are going to decrease. Now, the key here is being able to produce more force without putting on too much muscle, right? If you gain weight, you're producing more force, that's great, but you may not move as fast because you're having to push more weight forward. So the goal here is to be able to increase the amount of force that we can output around the same body weight without having to add too much extra muscle. Being dense and being lean, most runners are already really lean, so being able to add just a couple pounds of muscle not only improves the tissue tolerance, your movement quality, your resiliency, but it will let you improve your force, and it's going to be a net positive, right? And so that's all that we really want here, is to be able to get those times down and stay healthy. And these are the three primary ways that you're going to do so with proper strength conditioning training. All right, the next thing we got to talk about here are what are the common issues that runners have, and not in terms of like the symptoms and injuries you're having, but what is causing those. And I've kind of touched on these a little bit, but I'm going to break these down to four main areas where runners need to see improvement from the strength conditioning room or in the gym. So the first one is that they have usually a weak posterior chain. That means primarily glutes and hamstrings for runners, or they have overactive hip flexors. So I've already kind of talked about this, but improving your glute and your hamstring strength, one, is going to make every stride that you take more propulsive in nature, which is then also going to keep everything feeling good, but it's also going to keep that pelvis in a decent position, and we're not going to be stuck in an anterior pelvic tilt or orientation as well. And then that anterior pelvic tilt then also leads to then overactive hip flexors, and they're doing a bunch of the ground work to be able to continue to get us to pick our leg up. You're still going to have hip flexor strength and movement. That's always going to be a thing you have to do because you've got to be able to pick your leg up to run. But if you're over-reliant on that versus having the strong posterior chain, that can lead to some of those injury issues that we talked about earlier. Another one is that very runners have generally a weak trunk or a weak trunk musculature or core. And I hate that word core for the most part, but having stronger, not just like the six-pack abs, but strong obliques, TVA, things of that nature can help, one, control our trunk pelvis from having too much rotation of side to side in terms of running. Will be a little bit more fluid and will be a little bit more stable here. And by being able to do that, when our trunk is stronger, that means we have better pelvic control. So having better pelvic control then can help with, not having as much overactive hip flexors or trying to rely on bad movement patterns late in a race. Keeping this rigid, that's where all the force transfer always goes through, is through our midsection, regardless of what kind of sport you do. So being strong here makes sense. And again, you don't have to be big and blocky, but being able to be strong and control that pelvis is what's of most importance. They also generally have tight calves. That makes sense. They're constantly running and on your feet. So if that's the case, we know that the calves are the last thing to push off and push us forward. And so therefore, if the posterior chain is generally weak or underdeveloped, or the overactive hip flexors, you can bet the calves are going to follow suit. Okay, they're going to get tight and they're going to take a lot of the grunt, and then that leads to the Achilles issues that we talked about and the plantar fasciitis. So one, increasing the mobility, but also increasing the strength through big ranges of motion can do a lot to help address this, and then that will also help up the chain as well. So these two things work really well together. In terms of also having a strong trunk, we can control everything that's happening, which is then going to let us have a better performance. And then generally most runners, long distance runners in particular, are going to have a decreased hip stability. And so while even though they're doing things on one leg all the time, because if they've got weaker trunk, weaker posterior chain, tight calves, usually the hip stability is out the window. The low back's taking the grunt, the hip flexors are taking the grunt, right? The TFL's taking the grunt, the calves are taking the grunt. The small, deep hip musculature, the very small muscles deep in that hip, are likely not getting any kind of true training effect in terms of getting strong or aiding in the stability with hard loads, because the only load that you have is your body weight. For strength conditioning training, we can use loads with barbells and dumbbells and kettlebells and things of that nature to load those smaller tissues much more effectively, making them stronger, and then that syncing up with everything we have here. So if you're trying to focus on something in the weight room just in general, these are kind of like my 4 areas of where we want to attack things to be able to keep you not only healthy, but also decrease those times and let you immediately see return on investments, because if these things are improving, you will see your times decrease. All right, now let's get into the strength and conditioning side and what you should be doing. And the first is going to be just general quote unquote functional movement patterns. These still apply to you as runners. So if you're checking these boxes for your lifting patterns, you're going to hit a lot of the boxes that you need to in terms of getting stronger, maybe building a little muscle and being more resilient. So we want the squat pattern, the hinge pattern, pushing, pulling, single leg work, and a carry. And so I'm going to give you some examples here of things that you can do as a runner. So my first one that I really like for runners here is doing any kind of heel elevated goblet squat. And the reason I like this is because, again, if we're trying to address that anterior pelvic tilt, the tight hip flexors, we need to get the pelvis back underneath us. And so by using something to elevate our heels and anterior load, we're going to get increased trunk work, also benefit. We're going to stay in a nice position, and ultimately, with our pelvis being where we need to be, now we can actually train our lower body in an effective manner that's not going to be compensated based upon what most runners see. Also, by having this, we're going to get a nice big quality range of motion, so our squats can be deeper than if we use, say, like a box or just a regular barbell back squatting. You have hip mobility restrictions already, which if you're a long distance runner, you very likely do to some degree. But then also, that lets us train the quads quite a bit, which can be good because we want to prevent that patellofemoral issues. And so by training the quads in a nice big range of motion with a good appreciable amount of load, we can also help negate that as well. So this checks a lot of boxes for many runners. You could certainly use this as a front squat as well, or even a high bar back squat or a safety bar squat. But generally with most of my runners, they're doing heels elevated work almost year round because we're trying to prevent them from being in that anterior position as much as we possibly can. The next is going to be hinging, and my big one here is just going to be the RDL. And the reason I like the RDL for runners is because of the eccentric hamstring stress, all right? So you have to be methodical here when you start this. You don't want to go too crazy if you're new to this, but after you adapt and get used to it, you can load that eccentric workspace up, and getting good quality eccentric loading on the hamstrings, getting them stretched out underneath the load, one will improve your hamstring mobility, also improve your running mechanics, get your hamstring stronger, improve that tissue tolerance as we kind of talked about, and it's just a big bang for your buck exercise that really checks the box here. You can do it with a barbell, you can do it with dumbbells, doesn't matter, but that's kind of my go-to. You can also certainly do a hex bar deadlift if you want to deadlift, and this could be great for like when your running volume starts to get pretty insane and you want to try to limit some of that hamstring stress, which I don't think is a bad idea. If you've built that tolerance up and you're running up as you're supposed to, you can probably get away from it for just a little bit. And then you can go with like a hex bar deadlift. You can focus on really moving some weight, not having all that eccentric stress, but still training the hip hinge pattern for the most part. And then you can phase out of this. But really, they both have their benefits. But if you need to improve tissue tolerance, you would definitely want to hammer the RDLs more so. If you're trying to improve your maximal strength or force output, then your hex bar deadlift kind of gets the nudge. So kind of, for me, depends on where we're at from a seasonality perspective. Next is going to be just general pushing. This could be a variety of things, both unilaterally and bilaterally. So both arms, one arm, doesn't matter. Personally, if I'm doing one arm, I like to do alternating stuff so that way our rib cage mechanics are moving. Personal preference, but that's just my bias. And we can also do overhead pressing as well. So usually for runners, if I'm doing this, I'm actually going to go with like a decline or a neutral grip dumbbell bench press, something like that, if in terms of the horizontal side. And then I also really like the landmine for my overhead work for these athletes with opposite reaches, being in half kneeling positions or split stance positions, so that we get that hip flexor lengthening, we get the rib cage moving, and we're staying out in front, which lets us be more honest, because if they're already in a kind of extended position from that anterior position, going overhead is just going to exacerbate that, like directly overhead. So being out in front of us is going to help negate a lot of that. So those are kind of my go-tos in terms of push. Again, you could do these single arm, both arms, landmine, same thing. You could do both arms or one arm. I'll definitely lean towards more one arm work with the landmine. Pulling is going to basically be the same thing, but now we're going to do it horizontal pulling and vertical pulling. So with the horizontal pulling, with most of my runners, what I really like here is I really like inverted rows and dumbbell rows, chest supported dumbbell rows. And the reason I like those is that, one, it takes the low back out of the equation, and it's going to allow us to get a good amount of training adaptation from it, right? So I mean, you could use machines here as well, that's fine. You can also do these alternating. If you're doing like a chest supported dumbbell row, you can go alternating. But those are usually my bilateral options. And then for my unilateral options, I usually like doing any kind of like cable rows. And the reason I like cable rows is, again, we can get that alternating action that keeps our ribs moving. We can go with low stances, high stances. We can go half kneeling, split stance, staggered stance. The options are unlimited, that you can do with the cable options. And for me, with runners, I think it just works better for them. Now, the vertical side of it, which I got to get to that one, is usually here for bilateral. I usually just like straight up chin ups or assisted chin ups. You can obviously go with lat pull downs. That's also fine. But for the unilateral side, I still like to go to the cable rows and just adjust the height of it there. For me, that does more than enough work for what I need. So usually, in terms of the upper body side, you don't have to worry about checking all these boxes all the time. As long as you're getting a push and a pull, you're going to be good, because we really just want to maintain some quality upper body mass and make sure that we're getting some rotation throughout the trunk, in my opinion. The next thing we have here is the single leg work. Now, this is probably the most important. And if you're smart and methodical, you can check some of these boxes throughout different times of year doing single leg variations. So for most of my runners, I usually like doing front foot elevated goblet split squats here, because again, we talked about pushing their center of mass back, anterior load, keeping shin relatively vertical. That's also going to let us load up the glutes and the hamstrings as well, and a big range of motion in the quads as well. You can also do these with a reverse lunge as well, and you'll get a very similar training outcome. However, you're going to have more eccentric stress stepping back. You can even add in hip flexions. Okay, there's different ways that you can do this, but you can get a lot done with your single leg variations for your running. But then also from a hinging perspective, I really like hand supported RDLs and any kind of kickstand RDLs. That's going to let us, again, eccentrically load those hamstrings. You can also go with a single leg glute bridge as well. If you're just getting into this and you're trying to find a way to find that posterior chain and actually feel those, that's another thing that you can do as well for more beginners. Then last is going to be carry or any kind of abdominal work. I really like carry just in general. I like to have all my athletes do some kind of carrying variation throughout their training careers and very heavily rely on them. But for runners, to me, it's for sure a great thing because we are running, right? We're constantly just moving forward. So if we can load that musculature in that position, that's going to be better in the long haul. And really just any kind of like farmers or suitcase carries really check the box for most athletes. And I really lean towards the suitcase option because we can train the obliques on each side and focus on pelvic control as well. And if they happen to be having any kind of IT band issues, having that kettlebell or dumbbell on the opposite side is then going to drive more internal rotation in that hip, which is then going to get that TFL to relax. That can be incredibly important to battling some of those issues as well. You could also do different med ball, sandbag carrying variations as well. And also, just to add in extra abdominal work, then you also want to make sure you're doing things like leg raises and dead bugs and things of that nature. Abdominal work in general is important, but again, I lead towards the carry. So if you're looking at a template of things that you need to be doing, you've got a lot of different exercise variations here. You can see how these are not big bulky exercises, right? But if you're checking off a lot of these exercises in your strength training, you're going to get a good amount of work done. You're going to hit every major functional movement pattern that you need to, and we're making these somewhat specific towards the act of running to help negate some of those issues that you could potentially run into if you don't address them. All right, now that we got our main general movement patterns down, now we're going to focus on specifically the lower leg complex. And now, because of the amount of mileage that you're doing, and I've kind of talked again about the plantar fasciitis and the Achilles stuff and the stress fractures, we want to make sure that we're doing something in our training that's going to, one, prevent those, but strengthen that lower leg complex. And by lower leg complex, I'm talking basically from the knee between the ankle, even the foot does count, but basically everything below the knee. And so these are kind of my 5 go-tos of what I use to be able to address the lower leg complex in runners. The first one's going to be calf raises. Okay, this is probably the most basic one. Anybody can do them anywhere, and you probably understand how to do them if you're watching this video. Doing them seated and standing, you want to make sure you do both of them because they do train the musculature. So a seated calf raise focuses on the soleus, while a regular standing calf raise biases the gastrocnemius. Both are important, okay? So you need to train them. And the soleus is seen more as a postural-based muscle, but because we're in a bent knee position, we're going to focus on that soleus, and most runners don't get that. They're getting a lot of the gastroc because their leg is usually extended as they're going to push off, and so they're getting a lot of gastroc work. So I would bias the soleus work if you had to pick one, but if you can do both of them, especially if you're only strength training twice a week, one day you could focus on just regular calf raises, and the next day you could do soleus or seated calf raises, focus on the soleus, and you're going to check both boxes and be done. I don't really go too crazy with the reps here, right? I think it's important that you have a variety of rep ranges. As a runner, if I were you, I'd bias the heavier ones, things between 8 and 12 repetitions. And I say heavy because you don't want to do like sets of 3 or 5, right? We want to just have it enough load, but also focusing on a full range of motion. I cannot stress this enough. The biggest stretch that you can get with the load, all at the top, a good quality flex, and controlling the movement the entire time. That's going to give you a loaded stretch position, helping improve your ankle mobility, build up that tissue tolerance, and be stronger there. The next is heel walks. Now, heel walks are something I think are great from a warm-up perspective before you go out and run, after you run, before you do your strength training. This isn't necessarily something you need to plan, in my opinion, but walking around on just your heels, which is going to strengthen that tib anterior isometrically, and it's also going to stretch out your calves as well. It's basically just going to undo all the movements you're doing from doing plantar flexion all day walking around like that. So just doing some heel walks from starting off with only maybe 30 seconds and building up to being able to doing it for 90 seconds to 2 minutes, and then going on and doing your strength training will do a great job of overcoming some of the issues that you might have at the foot complex. So this is kind of like an easy one. You can literally do it anywhere. So to me, these are the top 2 that are the easiest ones to probably get done. The next ones are going to be a little bit more challenging depending on equipment and kind of time. The first is doing sled work. And so what I mean by sled work is doing sled resisted sprints. And the reason I like that is because when you're running, you have a load behind you, and now you're having to push more force in the exact same way that you run. You'll have a more forward lean when you're sprinting, obviously, but your calves are going to get more force output because of that load and having to push yourself farther, and you're going to get a good big stretch as you're going to actually sprint and get your whole foot from heel to toe off. You can also push heavy sleds here as well, or prowlers. That's also going to increase the magnitude of that load. Again, it's not going to be for speed. I usually go towards more of the heavier side in the off season, and as races and things come up, then I lighten that sled up or that prowler up and really focus more on the speed side of things and the higher forces from being able to push through the foot. So if you have access to this, this is great. If not, you may look at investing in a dragging sled, and you can literally do it outside on your road, a couple times a week, or even just one time a week in the off season, and really load that guy up. And that can also get you some conditioning as well without having to put in as much mileage. So lots of benefits to sleds, but I think it's really underlooked when it comes to improving the lower leg complex because of how much weight you can actually load up with that. And it is somewhat specific to what you're doing in terms of running because you're still trying to move forward, right? The other one is going to be a three-way ankle complex. Now this is more of like a rehabby personal or physical therapy based thing, but this is a good job of developing all the other small muscles in the lower leg complex. And the reason I like these is because we get to focus on eversion and inversion here, and that does a good job of being able to train those, and you can control it, and you can literally do it from home. Okay, you can literally do it anywhere, but it's going to strengthen all those perennial muscles in your lower leg, which get pretty much neglected. I mean, you don't really train those unless you're doing something like this or you're doing different balance pad work, which is another option. It's not something I go to a lot, but these are really my go-tos because it is low-hanging fruit. And again, we can kind of put it in the warm-up with heel walks, and we can make sure that we're addressing everything before we even go to run, jump, sprint, whatever that is. The last one's gonna be tib anterior raises. And you can do these in different ways. Some gyms you may find a machine that you can put your foot in and just raise your toe up to train that tib anterior. I don't have one of those. I'm not gonna waste the money on them, in my opinion. I just have my athletes put their foot in a kettlebell and have it off the bench, and then they raise it off the bench. It's the exact same thing done. You could also tie a band to a rack, put your foot in the band, and then pull it towards you as well, and that will also work. But that's gonna strengthen the tib anterior, which anytime you strengthen one muscle somewhere, so if I'm doing a bicep curl, for example, my tricep has to relax for me to do that. So by strengthening the tib anterior while I'm doing that, that will force my calf musculature to relax. But also, as we kind of talked about with compartment syndrome and shin splints, if you get this trained up early and you're doing this, you're less likely to have shin splint issues. And that also same thing goes with the heel walk as well, right? So these are kind of going after two of the same things, two different methods, but that's something else that I like to have my runners do. So if you're checking these 5 boxes, and again, this is a lot to add on top of what you're doing, so you don't have to necessarily do all these. For example, I talked about you can put your heel walks in your warm-up and your three-way ankle in your warm-up, and then if you're doing calf races on one day and sleds on another day, you've pretty much checked all the boxes with just 2 days of strength training, and then you can go from there. So hopefully that helps give you an idea of how I go after the lower leg complex. Definitely make sure these are in your training programs for runners specifically, or if you are a runner that you are doing these, I promise you they will solve majority of your lower limb issues that you won't have to worry about trying to actually backtrack after they flare up. So start early, get on these, and it will save you the hassle of having all those issues down the road. All right, the last thing we got to address here as runner is focusing on plyometrics. And I saved this last because I think many runners think that they don't need to do them because they are running. However, plyometrics are shown to improve power output. And the more power you have, the more force you can put into the ground. It improves that tissue tolerance. It's going to help you be faster. Even though you may be running for hours on end, how many times into that race, that last 15, 20, 30 seconds, you try to push the power, right? Being more powerful is going to let you do that. You're trying to increase that speed, that last leg. This will help you do that. But also, because of the tissue tolerance, we're going to get aided hip stability. Our Achilles, our knees, our hips are going to feel better. And so most of our plyometrics fall into these categories: vertical jumping, horizontal jumping, lateral jumping or moving side to side, pogo variations, which are more at the lower limb complex, which I'm a big fan of, and multi-directional jumps. So that's kind of like adding some of this together, moving in multiple directions, rotating through jumps, things of that nature. So with long distance runners in particular, I really like to focus on the horizontal as like my go-to thing. If I only had to pick one plyometric, it's going to be horizontal because you move forward. So if we can get more powerful forward, that's what we want to do. Any kind of broad jump variation here works great. You can do bilateral broad jumps, you can do band resisted, you could do multiple ones in a row, you can jump over a hurdle and then broad jump, which then starts to get into some of the multi work. You can do one leg landing on two, one leg to one leg, right? There's lots of different ways that you can do these, but that's kind of my go-to for runners. You definitely need to be doing horizontal plyometrics. Next is then going to be vertical, okay? Now, the reason vertical, because we actually gonna focus on, again, improving our force. So just having vertical jumping is a little bit more general, and that's okay, but if you can jump higher, you're going to be able to run faster. That's just proven. So if we can improve our vertical jump, improve our power output, we will run faster, and running faster is gonna decrease those times. Now, you can also do the single leg, and that's also gonna help you improve that hip stability as well, because you're landing on one leg. So that's the benefit there. Now, lateral plyometrics for running aren't as important. You're not moving side to side. However, because you don't move side to side, I would argue, and I like to have my runners do lateral plyometrics early in the off season. When their hard running season's done, if we're gonna do plyometrics, we're gonna get back to moving side to side. We know your mileage isn't gonna be high. It's not important in terms of like getting faster at that moment, but if we can get side to side and focus on getting out of our hip and into our hip and loading side to side like that, that's going to help our hips feel better, and that should be the utmost importance after big races or after your season is done. That's going to let us check that box, and that's where I like to use lateral plyometrics. It's just in phases, okay? I don't do them year round with my runners, but I do think that early in the off season, they do have value. Then finally is going to be pogos. Pogos I like to try to keep in as much as I can year round. When the mileage starts to get really high, a lot of times I will scrap them getting closer to meets, because I know that if we're doing our lower limb complex, we're doing our general strength training, and your mileage is high, I'm not getting a lot out of this if we've done all the work on the front end like we're supposed to. To me, I would much rather just take that away and not to deal with it and focus on maybe more extra hip mobility or lower leg complex with those other exercises I talked about earlier. And then you could add in multi. So if you're only being able to get in the gym one day a week, as I mentioned, you might be able to do like a hurdle hop to a broad jump, and that's going to let you check 2 boxes, right? Or you might be able to do pogos for time, and then you could do pogos and then go into a broad jump, right? You can mix and match these as much as you want. That's usually a time saver for me for runners. So again, you usually want to go here, and then your vertical. Laterals are seasonal, and your pogos are just going to be something you can add into your lower leg complex, especially early on in the season. Pogos and lateral hops to me are great things to add together in the off season. And then as the season progresses, these kind of things can kind of drop, and you can get more specific with vertical and horizontal jumping. The main thing with your plyometrics is that these should be done at the beginning of your strength training days, or if you go to the gym, these should be done first. You want high output, high effort, lots of rest. The goal here is to be able to have high quality work, okay? Lots of rest. Don't worry about having only a minute of rest. 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes of rest between some of these is not a bad thing. And then also, we want to make sure that we're not doing too much, okay? We don't want to do 10 reps of broad jumps every set. We only want 3 to 6 reps of most of our jumps, and then increase your sets over time to anywhere from 5 to 6 sets at the absolute high end. For runners, I keep them on the lower end. But if you're not running as much, you can obviously do more volume there. But you want your volume to come from your sets, not your reps, because again, we want high effort, high output, and we can only do that for a couple reps at a time, because after a while, then we become exhausted and we're jumping in an entire position, and now we're not getting what we're actually trying to get out of the movement, which is power, okay? And we want to be able to do that. We need short reps in terms of the numbers and higher number of sets to be able to get that volume over time. If I had to give you a rough estimate, usually if you're doing anywhere from between 25 and 35 total reps in one session, you're going to be fine. If you're doing this twice a week, that's going to give you 50 to 70 jumps. That is quite a bit of jumps when you really start to add it up, and you add that in with your running and your strength training. This will do enough to prepare you for what you need for running long distance. All right, one of the last things I want to cover here is when should you train? When should you do your strength and conditioning based work? And so there's going to be some optimal things, but we know that you just got to do the best with it you can. We all have different lives, different schedules, so I'm going to give you some different options here. The best thing that you could do is to do your strength and conditioning day on any off day that you have, okay? If there's a day that you don't run, that should be a day that you're in the gym, okay? Because you're not gonna have to worry about balancing and recovering from the running. You can get in, do something that's gonna aid your actual running, and then get out. Generally, your strength training can take 45 to 60 minutes, and you could probably make it less if you really want to really constrict stuff. So like the return on investment is very high. So off days is always going to be the best option if at all possible. Now, I know some people like to have their Sundays off. So if you do stuff with family, understanding you don't run that day and you don't want to go to the gym, I understand, then you're gonna have to resort to some of these other things. But if you got off days, use that to your advantage. The next best thing that you could do would be in the morning, okay? And the reason I say in the morning is because if you do it first thing in the day, 1, you're less likely to skip it, and 2, you're gonna be fresh as you can possibly be, right? You haven't ran, you haven't done anything, so you should be as fresh to be able to give as much effort as you can into the strength and conditioning stuff. And I think Not skipping it's a huge one. Like if you get it done, you don't have an excuse if something came up during the day. And again, if you only need between 45 and 60 minutes, you got to be at work at 8 o'clock. If you can get to the gym at 6, be done by 7, shower, get to the gym at 8, that's really not that bad to be able to get things done. Getting up earlier and anything sucks, but again, you only have to do it probably 2 times a week, and that's it. The other option is you can do it before your runs. So this part really sucks, but if you're in a really time crunch, if you're doing it in the afternoons or in the evenings, then you can go lift and then do your runs afterwards. And the reason I say that is because lifting will not harm your running in most cases. Will you be a little more tired? Yes, but your running will still benefit long-term from the lifting. If you run and then lift, your lifting will always be worse. You're never gonna be able to give as much effort. You're not gonna be able to build as much muscle. You're also gonna find reasons to skip it because you're tired or you're hot or your ankle's bothering you or your hips bothering you, right? If we can get in front of that and then go run, you're less likely to run into being able to skip it because again, I know as runners, you don't wanna lift. That's just not usually the thing you wanna do. So if you make yourself do it first, you're less likely to skip it. And then the option would be also do it on your low days. So if you gotta do it before your runs, or you got to do 2 a day, you got to lift in the morning and then run it in the evening, or for some reason you got to run in the morning, you got to lift in the evening. You got 12 hours, 10 hours, 8 hours to be cutting it, but if you have that much time in between, you probably will be okay. But you'd want to pick it on your lower days, your lower volume, lower miles days. That way that again, you're as recovered as you can and give as much effort as you can. If you've got a very long distance day, that is not a day to go do your strength and conditioning work. Just do your runs and that's it. Find the lowest days of the week or your off days to pick the days that you want. Try to get in early before you actually lift as much as you possibly can. If you've got to double down on them, do them before your actual running. And again, as I mentioned, if you're doing this, I think for most athletes, 2 to 3 times per week is more than enough to be able to help you see progress. Most of my athletes come to me 1 to 2 a week in high school and we see tremendous progress. But if you happen to not be in school and you have the time to be able to swing 2 or 3 times a week, and then this is fluid, right, too. So, I mean, as a meet is coming, your strength training competition's coming, your strength training can decrease down to 1 or 2 times a week so that you can focus on your mileage and focus on your recovery and do what you can to maintain or just slowly chip away at stuff. But if you're not running hard and you're not getting ready for a competition directly, increasing your frequency of your strength training would give you the better return on investment, and you can chip away at that and they can zigzag. So as your running is low and goes high, your lifting can be high and go low. So it's not necessarily a perfect world, but this gives you an idea of how you can balance your frequency of your running and your lifting, and it will just work out, right? It will keep your load relatively steady. It will keep your progress relatively steady, and you can focus more on what you need to those 3 days a week. If your body's banged up, get to feeling good, 2 months go by, now you go down to 2 times a week. You do that for a couple months. You're got 3 months that you're getting ready for your competition. Then you go 3 months that you can go 1 day a week, take a couple weeks off afterwards, be an actual human being, and then move on and repeat the process, right? So this is always fluid, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how you can do your strength training and when you can do your strength training to set you up for success. All right, so to wrap up, the big thing you need to understand here with your strength training for your running is that this is a long-term investment, okay? This is not something that you can just do 1 day a week for a month or 2 and expect to see a ton of progress and have it actually benefit your running. More than likely, you're just gonna bang your head against the wall and not see the progress that you want, and you're gonna invest a little bit of time and not see a whole lot of return. So this is something that you wanna just see as complementary to what you do as you're running. If you're being committed and running 3 to 5 days a week, adding 1 to 2 days of strength training should not be that much more to add to your plate. And you might have to be a little bit busy, and I understand that, but it may actually get you to be able to have to run less days and still see the same amount of progress, if not better progress over the long haul. So it is a long-term investment. If you do take your running seriously, it will help you. 2, it's ultimately gonna help keep you healthy. And if you're healthy, not only from just like a general health perspective, like feeling good and good quality blood pressure and all that kind of stuff, because most runners are relatively healthy, right? So we don't have to necessarily worry about the cardiovascular health, but the bone density and keeping your muscles strong and your movement patterns crisp, so you don't have overuse issues. If you're banging your body up, you're not actually really all that healthy because now you're having to work around those issues. So if you're doing this 1 to 2, 3 times a week, it can keep you healthy for your runs. And if you're healthy for your runs, now you're gonna have more successful runs. If you have more successful runs, you're not gonna have to skip out on things, and you're gonna be able to stack much more better days over the course of the long haul, going back to that long-term investment. The final thing is, at the end of the day, you're gonna be better. You are 100% going to be a better runner if you take the things I've implemented here today into what you do into the gym, focused on them, actually prioritize them. You will be a better runner. I 100% know this because I work with athletes every single day, and all of our runners drop times year after year after year. We do not have runners that do not see PRs in their season. It like never happens, from short distance to long distance. We also keep them healthy, and they're feeling good, and they're able to do the best they can, and they're in good shape compared to their constituents. And so if you are somebody that even runs recreationally, but you do like to go do races and actually compete and do your times, to me that tells me that you're serious. And if you're serious, take this serious, and it will get you better. And nobody likes to not get better. I don't know anybody that, if you're running 26 miles, I would never do that myself, but you clearly enjoy it and like doing it enough to compete, then if you add this to your routine, it will not be that much added to your plate, and you are going to see the progress that you do want to see and hit new PRs. And especially if you have not been doing high strength training and this is newer to you, you're going to get the newbie gained effect. Like within 6 months, like your numbers are probably going to drop astronomically more than what you were getting from just the running alone, because again, you probably are going to be healthy, and you are putting more force into the ground, and you are feeling better, and your runs are feeling better, and you're getting more from every single workout, and it just really starts to stack up really high. And so that's why I'm really passionate about strength training for running, because many runners don't like to do it, and I understand why, but it does give you the best return on investment. I wish, for what I like to do, I wish I could just lift 1 or 2 days a week and be more than happy to see the results that I want to, but because I like to lift weights and get stronger and do things, it's not as realistic. So again, these are the things that will ultimately help you. If you happen to have any specific questions, please let me know in the comment section below. I'd be more than happy to help you out the best that I can and giving you the best results possible. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.